I've been involved in aviation. Last 42, I've been involved defending airplane crash cases. I've seen just about every mistake people can make. And I started writing up these lessons, see what I could learn from them. And I discovered that the same mistakes that cause airplanes to crash cause people to have disasters in their personal lives. It's rather interesting to see the patterns that happen and how they can be avoided. I was told long ago that we study airplane accidents so we can learn what caused them and prevent accidents in the future. I'm also told that wise people learn from their mistakes, and really wise people learn from the mistakes of others. So what I've done, I've come up with some of these errors that happen over and over again that we can apply to our own lives. So fasten your seatbelts and I'll talk about some of them. Lesson number one I've learned is that if you keep making the same small mistake, eventually it's going to bite you. This accident happened to a military pilot. He was a decorated Navy pilot. He had his own Cessna 320. He was using this to go back and forth to get visitation with his daughters. And one thing I learned in this business is that professional pilots always live by their checklists. When we ignore the checklists, we have consequences. And professional pilots have their own special post-flight checklist. It's radio's off, switches off, rings off. That too subtle?
Wings on?
Rings off.
Oh, right.
Anyway, this pilot was divorced, and he was using his airplane to fly back and forth between Fresno and Fallon, Nevada to bring his daughters back for visitation. Now, this twin-engine airplane is a very simple fuel system. The left engine takes fuel from the left fuel tank. The right engine takes fuel from the right fuel tank. There is a cross feed on there where you can take fuel from the other tank. It's almost never used. In several thousand hours of flying, I think I've used it twice, and that was to demonstrate that I knew how to use it. But there's absolutely no reason for this guy to have been on the cross feed, but he was. He took off he had full fuel tanks in Fresno, 50 gallons each tank. He took off, he flew to Fallon, Nevada, and as he was in the traffic pattern, he lost power on both engines. He got too slow, he stalled, he crashed, the airplane burned and killed everybody. Interesting thing is that he had full fuel in the right tank and no fuel in the left tank. And the cross feed was on. So he was drawing fuel from the left tank only, feeding both engines. And that's why he ran out of fuel. But the pre-start checklist says fuel on the main tanks, cross feed off. He obviously ignored that. Pre-takeoff checklist says make sure your fuel is on the main tanks, cross feed off. In flight, he was burning fuel only from the left tank, which meant he was getting a very heavy right wing. You'll notice the fuel tanks are out of the tips of the wings, so it should have been very obvious to him. He would have had to keep retrimming it. We think that because he was at 14,000 feet without oxygen, he just wasn't paying attention. Then he came into the traffic pattern. He had a pre-landing checklist. He again ignored that. He was still on cross feed, and that's why he ran out of fuel at the worst possible time. But he ignored that little item 4 different times before it bit him. Now, how does that apply in our own lives? Well, I had an accident investigator I worked with who thought he had a happy marriage until one day he found out that his wife had left and cleaned out the bank accounts on the way out of town. It turned out that the warning signs were there. He really wasn't paying attention to her. And he got away with it for about 30 years until one day she had had enough and said, I'm out of here. I've looked at my own life. One thing I've learned is that I always say goodbye to my wife in the morning. I find if I pay attention to her, it pays big dividends. I don't always do it, and she reminds me of it, but it's a lesson I've learned that we don't take things for granted.
How about this morning?
Yes, even this morning I woke her up. She said, why'd you wake me up? Second big lesson I've learned is that if you don't have to do anything right away, do nothing until you think it through. This accident happened at Chicago O'Hare's American Airlines flight headed for Los Angeles. He took off. He was climbing out normally. He was above his best rate of climb speed. The left engine came off, and it came over the top of the wing. It cut the hydraulic lines on the left wing and pulled in the leading edge slats on the wing. Now, professional pilots are trained all the time. If you lose an engine, it's not a big deal. Use right rudder, use a little bit of right aileron, you maintain control, you slow down to the best rate of climb speed, and away you go. But in this case, he had more than a little bit of a problem. He had the engine out, so he needed right rudder, but he also needed a tremendous amount of right aileron. So something was wrong, something he was not used to. He was still flying. He had plenty of speed. He was able to climb out, but he should have recognized that something was wrong. Instead, he slowed down to best rate of climb as he was trained, and when he did, the left wing stalled. He rolled and schools out. We know exactly what happened because we have the flight data recorder. What should have happened is when he realized that something was wrong and something he hadn't seen before, you don't change anything. That's one thing we learned from that accident. You keep your speed, you set your flight engineer back, look at the left wing, find out what's wrong. Had he had done that, he would have recognized the engine's gone, the slat's up, which means you don't slow down. You maintain that speed. You find the longest runway you can, even if it's Iowa. You make that approach at that speed because you don't know what your stall speed is going to be on that wing. But it's actually something we learned, could have learned it earlier, because back in 1965, there was a similar thing happened to a Pan Am flight. He took off from San Francisco, headed for Honolulu. The number 4 engine had an uncontained turbine failure. It cut into the fuel tank, and it literally cut off 25 feet of wing. He knew something was wrong, didn't know what, and once again, he didn't slow down. He didn't panic. In fact, he said, folks, we're having a minor problem. We're going to have to go back and land. We know what happened because there was a passenger on the right side who had an 8mm camera, actually filmed the wing being cut off like a blowtorch.
Wow.
But he took it back and landed it. Boeing said that had he slowed down to best rate of climb, he would have crashed. So it's a reminder of something we learned a long time ago, or should have learned.
Speed and height.
Yes. Third thing I learned is, by the way, on this, one of the life lessons I've learned is that when I was a young lawyer, I had a lawyer on the other side who sent me a really nasty letter. And of course, I created an equally nasty letter. But I was smart enough to put it in the drawer overnight, say, I'll think about this in the morning. And I didn't send it out. It turned out we got along fine. We actually on the same side of a couple of cases. A couple of times I've forgotten that lesson. In fact, I was in a deposition with a Philadelphia lawyer who was being a really obnoxious jerk, and I was just trying to bite my tongue, not say anything. Then finally I objected to one of his questions. He said, I don't understand your objection. And I said, I'm not surprised. And of course, it did cause a little bit of a blow up, and I did apologize to the press. But so many times I found that we really don't have to do things right away. If we stop and think about it, I tell my clients, before you push the send button on an email, just imagine you're going to see this blown up poster size in front of the jury. Absolutely. Or on the front page of the LA Times. Do you really want to do that? Oh, yeah. And most of the times we really don't have to do anything right away. Third lesson I've learned is that the way we do anything is the way we do everything. We had a crash several years ago. It was a doctor who was flying between his office in Bakersfield coming home to Santa Barbara, crossing over the mountains. And the weather wasn't so good, but didn't bother him. But he cleared the ridgeline by minus 20 feet.
That's been done before.
Now, there was really no reason for it. He wasn't instrument rated, but if you know that if you're in the clouds and you're less than 1,000 feet above the ground, there's no instrument flight going to be cleared down with you. So there was absolutely no reason for that. He simply wasn't paying attention. He had the instruments in the cockpit. In fact, his instrument panel should have been glowing red, telling him, "You're down too low, pull up." But he didn't. And he cleared. Had he been 21 feet higher, he would have cleared the ridge line, he would have made it home safely. But we found out that was not the only mistake he had made. He didn't have any insurance on the airplane because the insurance policy didn't cover him until he had 30 hours of flight time in the airplane. He didn't have it. So we had it for the insurance company. We sued his estate to get the money back that we had to pay for the airplane. He also had a bad business deal with his mother. After the accident, the mother sued his estate, collected on that. And the poor wife was literally left penniless because he wasn't paying attention. But that wasn't the only problem. He had several malpractice suits going out against him. He simply wasn't paying attention to what he was doing. And it culminated in a fatal accident. And it culminated in a very serious situation for his wife and his family. Not something you want to leave behind. The other lesson I've learned is that sometimes we get boxed in, we have no choice but to push through. And the trick, what I learned is if you're boxed in, you find a hole in the box. This was an accident we had where it was a fallen gnat being used in the movie Hot Shots. And there was a former military pilot out here who wanted desperately to fly in that movie. And he found a fallen gnat owner in Florida, and he schmoozed him and convinced the guy to let him fly the airplane in the movie. So they started out in Florida coming home. They took off from Kissimmee, Florida, landed in the Panhandle for fuel. And the weather was absolutely horrible all the way across country. Their first intended stop was in Dallas. They got in the air, they were running short on fuel, they diverted to Shreveport, Louisiana. They made a low pass Louisiana, they missed the approach, pulled up, ran out of fuel, and crashed. Now, lots of mistakes there, but the first question was, who was flying the airplane? The front seat was the only one that had the instruments available for instrument flights, so whoever was in the front seat was the one flying that airplane. But when the airplane crashed, the two ejection seats separated from the airplane. By the time the investigators got there, the coroner had already removed the bodies. So nobody documented who was in the front seat, who was in the back seat. And for some reason, the NTSB assumed that the owner of the airplane was the pilot in command. They wrote it up that way. And the former military pilot's wife sued, claiming that the guy in the front seat was negligent, and the movie company was negligent for putting pressure on him to get that airplane out there despite the weather. Now, this was a very big case, and we knew that that hotshot pilot was not going to sit in the back seat, let anybody take him as a passenger in that kind of weather. And how do we prove it? Well, it turned out that the coroner's photos were missing, so that wasn't going to help. But we weren't about to pay that kind of money on that kind of a claim, so my boss told me, it's your job, find it, it's there. So I kept peeling the onion, and I found a deputy sheriff back in Bossier Parish who had actually been on scene of the accident before anybody arrived. He took photos, and then when half the world arrived, he left, put the film in the drawer, and I called him, and he still had the film and had it printed. It turned out we had photos of Mr. Pilot seated in what we could definitely prove was the front seat of that airplane. So there was a way to get by it. And there are other times when we get boxed in, we have no choice, we have but to push on, find some other way. One of my favorite cases I handled was a case in France that lasted 8 years. It was an airplane operated by Air Mauritius. The airplane had 3 hydraulic pumps on it. They were electric hydraulic pumps with a new design. The airplane landed in Mauritius. The right-hand pump started a fire and did $15 million worth of damage on the airplane. We knew that the problem was not the pump. Airbus had actually made a change to the circuit design, which was basically like putting a penny in the fuse box. So when the pump was forced to run in an overheated condition, eventually it started a fire in the right-hand wheel well. But once again, we were in France against Airbus. Airbus was claiming it's all the pump's fault. We were saying it's not the pump, it's the circuit protection. The airline was sitting there saying, we don't care who did it. Our insurers paid for it, we want it back. And we had a French judicial expert, and it talked about being hometown. It's kind of like you're playing soccer against the French national team, and the referee is the mayor of Paris. We were going toe-to-toe with Airbus, and we really had the facts on our side, but we really didn't have the referee on our side. And we knew we had to do something different. Through a little bit of digging, I found that we found a copy of the portion of the sales agreement for the airplane. And that sales agreement said that disputes arising out of this agreement or any of the transactions contemplated thereby will be resolved in a New York court under New York law. Now, under French law, they had a right to recovery, but under New York law, it was a complete defense. And we couldn't understand why Airbus wasn't waving that like a flag. Well, it turned out we were in a bar with the adjuster for the airline with loose lips. He told us there was a side deal between Airbus and the insurer that they would make sure they put it on us and they would leave Airbus alone. So at that point,
That's illegal, by the way.
not in France. But I took a look at that and said, wait a minute. Any transaction contemplated thereby, well, Vickers had provided a warranty for these pumps, so we took the position that's a transaction contemplated by the agreement. So we started a separate action in New York, asking the New York for judgment that neither the damage to the airplane nor the loss of use were recoverable, and neither Vickers nor Airbus had any liability for those damages. Well, Airbus got hold of that suit, and they said, what in the world are you doing by suing us? And their New York lawyer said, my God, why would we oppose this? So all of a sudden, we've been fighting toe-to-toe with Airbus for 2 years. Now they're on our side. We got to New York, we got a judgment. We had it translated into French. We took it back to France. In France, you had to get the French government to sign off on a deal like this to make sure it wasn't contrary to public policy. But now we had Airbus carrying the spear, and we got a judgment in France that shut down the whole lawsuit. So we started out looking at a $15 million claim. Now we're paying nothing. But we had to do it a different way. But it reminded me of an old story that even mortal enemies can find a way to create a win-win situation. There was an old Cajun fisherman who was down in the bayou, who was out looking for bait one day. He found a huge frog that he wanted, but it was in the mouth of a giant water moccasin. He looked at that and said, man, I sure would like to have that frog for bait, but I don't know, that's an awful mean-looking snake. He said, no, I want that frog. So he reached out, he grabbed that snake on the back of his head, made him drop the frog in the bait box. By this time, the snake was really angry. He was whipping violently, trying to get away. The fisherman was afraid to let go because he knew that snake would bite him. He didn't know what to do. Then he remembered he had a flask of whiskey in his back pocket. With his free hand, he managed to get the flask out, got the cap off, poured some whiskey down the snake's mouth. Then the snake's eyes rolled back and the snake went limp. He said, "Whew." He threw that snake way out in the water, sat down and started fishing. After about an hour, he felt something tapping on his toe. He looked down, there was that snake with another frog. The other lesson I learned is that accidents happen quickly and unexpectedly, so be prepared. You know, all the accidents I've handled over the last 42 years, probably the common denominator is that normal, healthy, happy people get on an airplane. They have no idea they're not going to get out alive. And it's not just airplanes. You know, at one point I figured I had more time flying airplanes than I did driving cars. But I know more people have been killed in car accidents than airplane accidents. In fact, one of them was my brother. He was 28 years old. Driving to work one morning, truck ran him over in a heavy fog. Never knew what hit him. So it's important that we keep track of our things. What would happen to us today if we didn't get home alive? When I was a young lawyer, I was told that the best lawyer in the office is the one who has his affairs in such good shape that if he got run over by a bus, somebody could sit down at his desk and pick up the ball and run with it. But what would happen to us if we went home? Do our spouses know the passwords to our computer? Are they signatures on our bank accounts? Could we, in fact, could they survive without us if something happened to us? But more than that, you know, what kind of a legacy do we leave behind? You know, people can always say something good to say about something at a funeral. But what would they say about us 5 years after the funeral? What have we done to leave a legacy behind? That's the real important thing, in my view. But the few things we can take home from this, maybe you can use it in your own lives. Number one is take care of the little things before they become big things. When I was married, the priest said that in marriage, the little things are the big things. If you take care of the little things, they don't become big things. And eventually you can avoid a disaster from it. Number two is identify and correct repetitive mistakes and break the pattern. One of the things I discovered is that I had a habit of not proofreading my letters properly, and I'd make little mistakes, little errors. The way I learned to solve that is, instead of assuming that everything was right, assume it's wrong and make sure it's right. So when I did a copying and paste, make sure I changed the date, work backward from the bottom, make sure I spelled the person's name right, make sure I didn't leave something in there from another letter that I didn't want there. But it's always easier to do it right the first time than it was to do it over, explain why I didn't do it right. But find out what you're doing wrong, break the pattern. They say that in 21 days we can change any pattern, we can change any habit by setting a new habit. Number three is think things through before taking rash action. We've all done it. Too many times, do I really want to do this? If you're not sure, set it aside, think about it. Maybe tomorrow you won't decide to do it. And number four is keep the affairs in order, be proactive. Make sure that what we leave behind is what we want to leave behind.
About the 737 MAX, what's the story there?
I think the head's going to roll over that one.
Well, I mean, it sounds like from the news reports that it's really the company that were building the thing, took shortcuts.
They were. In fact, the word is that Boeing was told it would cost them $1 million per airplane if they had to have separate, simulator training for this type of airplane. So they decided, we'll just keep this as a separate, and we'll just keep training, differences training on a, iPad, not send them to the simulator. Didn't even tell them about the MCAS system was on the airplane, yes.
Yeah, so isn't it true though, all the US pilots are trained on the MCAS and how to turn it off?
They were not.
Oh, they were not?
They were not even told the MCAS was on the airplane, they were livid about it. What happened is that when the string started running away, they knew to reach down and do it. Typically, on any airplane, if the autopilot starts giving you a problem, there's a little button on this, you push the button, that cuts off the autopilot, you hand fly it. MCAS, you had to reach down here to the trims, that's what was different.
Well, it's because ever since they moved the wings, the balance of the plane was totally different when they moved the wings back.
What happened was, the bigger engines, they had to move it up and forward.
Right.
So now, at a high angle of attack, it actually creates a pitch-up moment.
Yep.
If the pilot's not aware of it, or not, it can create a stall at low altitude. So the MCAS was there, I think of it as a gorilla in the jump seat was pushing on the controls. And it was pushed so hard it was beyond the capability of the pilot to overcome it.
And they didn't even know it was there.
They weren't even
That's
told it was there,
unbelievable.
which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Hey, John,
Yes.
is it ever gonna get off the ground?
What's that?
Is it ever gonna get off the
Yes,
ground?
it will. But they're taking their good sweet time to make sure that it's not gonna bite them this time. And the FAA, head of the FAA told his people, take your time, don't rush it. Make sure it's right before it goes back in the air. So,
I think that's a good.
word right now, it'll probably go back in the air in March.
Hopefully.
But I think you're gonna find a lot of people say, I think I'll pass on flying that. I'm not too worried about it with the US pilots. In fact, there were 2 incidents in the US where the MCAS malfunctioned and the pilots were able to cut it and deal with it. And the day before the Lion Air crash in Indonesia, on that very same airplane, they had the very same runaway. But they had a pilot in the jump seat who figured out what was going on and took care of it.
Nice.
So isn't the lack of pilot training in that particular case, the pilot in command only had less than 20 hours on the plane?
Well, and the co-pilot in the Ethiopian crash, co-pilot had 200 hours. Quite frankly, I do not fault the pilot for not figuring out what's wrong when you're fighting for your life 200 feet above the ground. It's not right.
Yeah, that's not right.
But as I say, the US pilots were livid when they found out that they weren't even told about the MCAS system on the airplane.
Last question.
Okay, so you told the story about the doctor who was flying. Did anyone ever consider that it could have been suicide? Exactly.
We don't think so. It's possible.
Okay.
Yes, it's possible. Maybe even subconsciously, hey,
Right.
God, I'm having all these troubles, get me
water.
out of here.
Yeah,
God said, I can do that. It is possible.
yeah.
All right, thank you, John. As everyone knows, we always have a speaker gift for our speakers. In their name, we provide supplies for one safe childbirth in our midwife program in Niger. And our own club members and speakers also receive that same gift. So here you are. And let's get a quick pic here. All right, thank you very much.